Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Seiko, and I'd like to welcome you to our Reading the Room discussion series. Thanks for joining us today. Our Reading the Room series centers on discussions with researchers, practitioners, and community members on the science of reading, evidence-based literacy instruction, and related policies that affect students and teachers. We're pleased to share this 9th event with you, focused on determining students' responsiveness to reading instruction for interventions. NCIL staff and partners will come together to share their perspectives on this topic. The event will be recorded and posted to the NCIL website. We also ask that you please use the Q&A feature to post questions for our panelists, and we will take some questions at the end as time permits. At this time, I'd like to provide a very brief overview of NCIL for those of you who may not be familiar with the center. The National Center on Improving Literacy is a federally funded national comprehensive center established by the Every Student Succeed Act, or ESSA, in the fall of 2016. It is jointly administered by the Office of Special Education Programs and the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. We are a partnership among literacy experts, university researchers, and technical assistance providers from these organizations under the direction of Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Here is NCIL's mission, which is to increase access to and use of evidence-based approaches to screen, identify, and teach pre-K through grade 12 students with dyslexia and other literacy-related disabilities. We have 5 main priority areas: to identify or develop free or low-cost evidence-based assessment tools for identify students at risk of not attaining full literacy skills due to a disability. Identify evidence-based literacy instruction, strategies, and accommodations designed to meet the specific needs of such students. To provide families of these students with information to assist their child. To identify or develop evidence-based professional development for practitioners and provide technical assistance to stakeholders. And finally, to disseminate our products to regionally diverse entities. So at this time, I would like to introduce to you our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Lena Edwards-Santoro. She is the director of NCIL, or NCIL, and is a research professor with the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University. Dr. Santoro focuses on projects related to professional learning, technical assistance, and instructional interventions for students with literacy-related disabilities. Her research emphasizes literacy instruction for struggling readers and writers, with a specific interest in supporting student development of oral and written language skills, vocabulary, and comprehension. She is a former special education teacher. Lena?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Welcome, everybody. I'm thrilled to be a facilitator today related to our NCIL Reading the Room session on determining students' responsiveness to reading instruction for interventions. Our panel discussion will focus on how to determine students' responsiveness to instruction in intervention. And just for some context, response to intervention, or RTI, is a recommended practice in the authorized Special Education Law Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. And that although implementation can vary widely across states, and even there's variability within states, there are several components of RTI that most educators agree that are essential. And those include universal screening in target areas like reading, research-based instruction to ensure that all students have an adequate opportunity to learn, successive tiers of instruction that are provided with opportunities for more intensive intervention, and ongoing progress monitoring for students to ensure that they are making adequate progress and that instructional practices can be adapted to meet their special needs. The purpose of this Reading the Room panel conversation is to address one of the most significant components of RTI, and that's responsiveness to instruction in interventions. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the panelists who will join me for our discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Kelly Justice. Kelly has served as a learning and development facilitator for the University of South Florida since 2007. She provides technical assistance, training, and support to school districts throughout the southern region of Florida and has presented at the state and national level on problem solving and multi-tiered systems of support and related topics. Prior to joining the project, Kelly was a general education teacher for 10 years. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in early childhood education and Master of Educational Leadership degree, both from the University of South Florida. Kelly is the co-author of books, including RTI and the Classroom Teacher, a guide for fostering teacher buy-in and supporting the intervention process, and Fidelity in RTI, strategies to ensure the intervention integrity in your schools. She's also the author of a chapter relevant to our conversation today. It's called The Integrity of Intervention Implementation, and that's in What Do I Do When? The Answer book on RTI. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. And next is Carolyn Turner. Carolyn is the Ohio Literacy Lead with the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. She works with local, regional, and state level instructional leaders to build their capacity to implement evidence-based reading instruction within multi-tiered systems of support. Carolyn is a doctoral student in reading science in the reading science program at Mount St. Joseph University and a dyslexia interventionist. She advocates for reading science and has extensive knowledge of evidence-based approaches to teaching reading. She ensures that all leaders have the appropriate knowledge, skills, and abilities to sustain change, resulting in improved instruction and successful reading achievement for all learners. Hello, Carolyn, and welcome.
Thank you, Lena.
And finally, we have Jessica Searles. Jess Searles is a research scientist at Boston University's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Jess partners with literacy experts and university researchers to integrate current research and professional learning for classroom practitioners, leadership, and educational agencies. Her work includes curriculum development, supporting educators with the implementation of evidence-based literacy practices, and guiding elementary school leaders in building and sustaining an effective school-wide reading system. Prior to working at BU Wheelock, Jess worked as a school district coach, Title I reading specialist, instructor of multilingual learners, and a classroom teacher. Hi, Jess, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Great to be here with you all today.
Well, thank you all so much for joining this conversation on this really important topic. The first thing I wanted to do is just sort of level set a little bit. We're talking about responsiveness to instruction and intervention. And within that context, I think the terminology and that phraseology sort of says what it is, but I wanted to break it down a little bit for everybody by dividing it into what is responsiveness, what do we mean by responsiveness, and then what do we mean by the instruction in intervention piece. And so I'll just go around the room for the first part. What does responsiveness mean to you? How do you define the responsiveness piece? And Kelly, I'll start with you. You're in the upper left here for me.
Okay. Yeah. So when I think about responsiveness, I think about the database problem solving process that we use, because to me, and I think I've shared this with my friends in the room recently, RTI really makes the most sense to me when I think about it within the context of a database problem solving process. So if we think about that database problem solving process, we clearly identify students' current levels of performance and compare that to where we expect them to be. So if there should be a gap between where we expect students to be and where they currently are, then we engage in some problem analysis to kind of look at some of those barrier skills or underlying causes of that underperformance. Then use that very important information to design instruction or intervention that is matched to the need based on that problem analysis. And then that's where the RTI comes into play, so the response to instruction and intervention, in that we use that plan that has been carefully devised, implement it, and then monitor students' response as a result of very careful progress monitoring. And by quantifying that gap initially between where our expected level of performance and our current level of performance is, we're able to really monitor the closure of that gap or the acceleration of the student performance over time. So really looking at level of performance over time and the rate at which that student or group of students is improving. And that yields some very important information as far as next steps for us as an educator, and really guides our subsequent planning for instruction.
Wonderful. No, thank you for laying that out. And I think there's so much in what you said that is just salient to responsiveness, the database decision-making, the progress monitoring, looking and faithfully attending to that data to make instructional adjustments. And you highlighted all these critical variables that I know we will unpack as we continue to talk with each other. But Carolyn, what, from your perspective, sort of unpacking that piece of what responsiveness is about and responsiveness to instruction and intervention?
Yeah, I think Kelly really hit all of the key factors in there. It's really about, is the instruction making an impact on those identified skill areas? And when we're talking about intervention, we really are focusing on, for many learners, some pretty discrete skills that we have to drill down, find the root cause for, and look to see whether or not that instruction that we're providing is making an impact. And we do that through progress monitoring. We do that through fidelity of implementation monitoring to make sure that what we are doing as the adults is really having an impact on that particular student or group of students in some cases.
Makes sense. Yeah. And I think connecting what I'm hearing from both of you, it is a system, it's systematic, and the problem solving piece is really key, which we will, it's a great introductory piece to that part of the conversation. Jess, anything to add about responsiveness?
Yeah, I'll just expand on what my colleagues have kind of already said, just thinking about responsiveness, meaning students are learning the content similar to what Kelly was saying, like adequate or ambitious rate, right? We know that these students who are receiving intervention supports, just achieving that adequate growth may not be enough. They may actually need to be accelerated and making that like even more gains, more ambitious gains to kind of bridge some of those gaps that are existing in instruction. And I think just overarching more broadly within that system, really the aim of that system is to monitor the responsiveness, to identify the students that are at risk for reading difficulties early in a schooling continuum. So really trying to hit that early intervention as quickly as possible with that high quality evidence-based instruction. So we know students are receiving high quality instruction across a continuum of support and instruction and intervention. And we're not just trying to intervene without having some really solid intervention and instruction in place across the tiers of prevention within that system to really support all the learners in our school building or in our school district or in our state, whatever kind of level you are in that process.
Yeah, thank you for adding that additional detail. From what you all are saying, it just reminds me a shift in conversation in our field that I think for a long time, we called this response to intervention. And I think we're shifting to responsiveness. And I think that is a really important shift. And it picks up what you all are saying, that there's this active piece of really monitoring student performance to determine if there's growth. And that sort of central to that. But the responsiveness sort of struck me as you all were talking. Let's take the other piece. So responsiveness to instruction in intervention. Let's take the instruction in intervention piece. So what does that sort of mean to you? How would you define instruction in intervention? And so I'll maybe start with Carolyn here and then move through the discussion.
Yeah, I think we first have to really make sure that we define what an intervention is and look at the key principles of an intervention. When we're looking at students who have severe and persistent learning difficulties, we really have to make sure that we're not just enacting a series of activities along the way, but we're really looking at well-designed instruction. So we're looking at teaching to mastery. We're looking at lessons that have that intentional instructional design. We're looking at explicit, systematic. We're looking at a well-defined scope and sequence. And so we're making sure that within those sessions that we have with our students, that there is that adequate design of the instruction, but then also that we're delivering the instruction in a well-intentioned way, making sure that students have lots of opportunities to practice, making sure that the practice is the right kind of practice and that we're bringing in and weaving in all of those key components at the right time, making sure that those interventions, skills that we are teaching within that session, there's also the opportunity to teach for transfer. It's not just about what we're doing in the intervention. We really want to make sure that they're transferring those skills and carrying those skills over into core content in core content classes. So I think it's really about those components and making sure that we have a well-defined intervention platform that we're using that really sets itself apart from just a series of maybe activities that we hand off to students to do and hope that something will occur out of that.
Right. Thank you. So so there's multi dimensions to the instruction and intervention piece. Jess, I'll let you add on.
Yeah, and again, it is an add-on to, like Carol, she helmed so many pieces there just about that well-designed piece of instruction and intervention. And I generally think about it, even just talking with educators and leaders, like 2 buckets. Like there's this, the what bucket and the how bucket. And both of those buckets have to be being like filled simultaneously. So thinking about your what bucket, that targeted instructional component, where are the gaps? Where are those areas of focus? Be it phonemic awareness or phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, integrating cognitive processing for students who need that additional support, especially in those intervention settings. And then the how bucket being exactly what Carolyn was talking about as well, that like very clear, explicit, systematic instruction. We're following a scope and sequence. It's not like a haphazard trying to plug holes in a pipe and then everything's still leaking out somewhere else. Like, how are we really systematically addressing those needs, giving multiple opportunities for students to respond, and really integrating pause points within that instruction as students are participating in the we do and we do together and the you do, where we're pausing and giving really specific feedback as instructors to proactively correct errors, to do some pre-correcting, to provide that immediate corrective feedback, and then also motivation, knowing that that's a huge piece of instruction as well, continuing to motivate students to continue to engage in the learning and engage in the content that we're presenting. And I think a big piece of that instruction and intervention, especially again in that intervention piece, as we're talking about assessment, being really strategic about our assessment and using that assessment to inform what we're doing next in that instruction and intervention, but not at the expense of instructional time. So often we'll find that like assessment becomes this big thing and we don't get the instruction to students, but really being really strategic and intentional about when we are assessing, collecting progress monitoring data, collecting mastery data, to constantly kind of adjust where we need to be focusing in on with that content of the instruction and intervention setting.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. No, I really like how you framed it with the how and what, right? So it's what we're teaching, but how we're doing it. And then that assessment is really part of it. It's not a separate thing. So even though we're saying instruction in an intervention, we are still thinking about an integrated assessment. It's just part of it. It's integrated. So yeah, Kelly, a little bit more if you wanted to speak to instruction and intervention.
It's hard to add more. They've done such a great job so far. I think the only thing that I might add is just, I really liked the way you phrased the question and the emphasis on instruction, because I think it's so important that when we think about our continuum of tiered instruction and intervention, that we understand that it's all instruction. It's just at a more intensive level. And so we really want to make sure that when we're providing more tier 2 supplemental type instruction or our most intensive individualized instruction, tier 3 type instruction intervention, that it is aligned and that it is supportive of the goals of tier 1 and our core instruction and curriculum. And I think that is an important thing to emphasize with school-based educators across the district as you're building your system, so that that is a very aligned fluid system within which children can access the supports just by virtue of needing that more intensive targeted instruction, and then fade as necessary. Some children will need that sustained support over time. Others will just need it temporarily. So I liked the way in which the question even itself was phrased as far as thinking about instruction within that intervention. I think that gives us an opportunity to really drive that point home.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And you're saying something that I want to connect to and move into with more depth. And that's the intensity. That's the intensification, intensity piece, and what that means, and how that supports helping accelerate student learning, which is essentially, I think, at the core. We want to monitor that progress and make sure students are making gains in reading. But part of that is understanding that if they're not, we have to intensify and provide additional support. So I'm going to grab what you said about intensification and go into that a little bit, because that's a really key piece of this. And so, Carolyn, I know you've done a lot of work related to instructional design and delivery. So I want you to speak to that, but apply it to the model of intensification. Yeah.
Yeah, so when we look at this model, especially within a multi-tiered system of support, it's hard to pull apart intensification of instruction or intervention if you don't start looking at your core instruction. And so when we situate interventions within a multi-tiered system of support, and we look at that instructional design, instructional delivery, that's really carried across the system. And looking at those tiers of support, it's not that we have, tier 1 students and tier 2 students and tier 3 students, but it's really, and Kelly was speaking to this, the intensity of the instruction that we're providing along the way. And even our students who have been identified with learning disabilities are all still situated within that multi-tiered system of support and that continuum of supports that we're providing within that intervention. So starting with that good, strong core, and looking at the instructional design, instructional delivery, the practice opportunities, the way that the instructors give feedback and how the student responds to that feedback is all really part of that intensification process, along with looking at good assessments, starting with valid and reliable screeners, because if we're not going to start with a reliable screening system, it's going to be really difficult to match students appropriately to the interventions that they might need in order to make progress and exceed and accelerate their progress along the way.
That makes sense, and that sets the groundwork. So when we talk intensification is applicable to multi-tiers. And so looking at the core, I think, is such an important highlight. That's where we start. We got to look at that core instruction. Everything builds from that. So really important point. So Jess, I'm thinking now, how do I look at deeper tiers of instruction, say tier 2, tier 3? What does that instruction look like? How is it different from the core instruction? So we're again applying this idea of intensity to that. How do I know what I'm doing or what I'm looking at is different? What does that mean for intensification?
Yeah. Again, going along with exactly kind of tracking along with Carolyn, the whole thing of those students who are receiving, whether they're SPED identified or not, receiving services across those tiers of support. And as they're moving into those more intensive tiers or doses of instruction, one of those intensifications would be just merely more time. Like they're getting more time if they're receiving services in tier 2 or tier 3. But we know just time isn't, in and of itself great if we're not providing high quality instruction during that additional time. So looking at that time in tier 2 and tier 3, how can we make it more explicit? How can we make it more systematic and make sure we're still continuing to follow that scope and sequence? And the more we can align it with that core scope and sequence, so students aren't getting piecemealed across their day, helps with that alignment and attention to transfer. So what students are doing in tier 3 can transfer to tier 1. What students are doing in tier 2 can transfer to tier 1. And I think just about the opportunities to respond, lots of opportunities for students doing the practice, the ones doing the talking or the ones doing the learning, right? So making sure we're getting our students to really get more intensive opportunities to speak, to listen, to read, to write within those tier 2 and tier 3 settings. More of that we do, more of maybe that we do together with teacher feedback For example, if we're thinking about just opportunities to respond, a concrete example, maybe your goal in tier 1 is 3 to 5 opportunities to respond per minute. So as students are responding, they're responding, listening, speaking, reading, and writing 3 to 5 times per minute. If we're looking at more intensive support in tier 2, maybe our goal is 6 to 8 responses by students per minute tier 2 setting. And then how do we intensify that even more with more opportunities for students to respond in tier 3? We have students responding 8 to 12 times a minute in that tier 3. So really looking at how do we increase that intensity? How do we increase that amount of practice? How do we increase that amount of feedback that we're providing throughout that practice as we're moving across those doses of instruction to support students?
I think your examples of the alignment, student responding, increasing the opportunities for them to respond and participate sort of gives me the idea of what I see when I'm looking at more intensive instruction, group size, time, all those other variables as well. Kelly, I know you do so much to support schools. What are some of the things you look for when you are thinking about intensification, and how do you support the schools that you work with in this area?
Yeah. So much of what I try to reinforce with schools and districts aligns really nicely with what's been said already, especially what Jess was saying as far as maximizing those opportunities for response and for corrective feedback. We talk a lot about and caution districts and schools against time and resources are always tight, at least for the districts and schools that I serve. And so there is a temptation to use, excuse me, I'm so sorry. There is a temptation to use some computer-based programs as interventions. And certainly those can provide practice opportunities, but it does not provide the corrective feedback that is so valuable in that eyeball to eyeball direct instruction that we're really looking for when we talk about even differentiated instruction, but especially tier 2 and tier 3 intervention. When I work with schools and districts, I talk to them about the various ways that we can intensify. And so Jess alluded to that idea of increasing time. So that's either increasing the duration, the length of the instructional session, the frequency, how many times a week we're providing intervention. We can also, which aligns nicely with what Jess said about those opportunities to respond, we can reduce the size of the group. So looking at fewer students in the group provides them that more intensified, more individualized support. We can also narrow the focus of that instructional time or that intervention to fewer barrier skills. And so I mentioned that problem analysis within our database decision-making process. When we intensify, that depth of problem analysis becomes greater. So we're looking more carefully at individual needs. Oftentimes, as we do individualize and intensify, we look at some diagnostic data that yields important data as far as strengths and areas of need, or any barrier skills or prerequisite skills that might be missing. So I think those are the big 3 ways. I mean, that's certainly not limited. That's not an exhaustive list, but some good just rules of thumb or guidance that we can use when we're thinking about making instruction more customized to individual learners or to smaller groups of learners.
I think that really helps. And what I'm hearing across all 3 of you in this discussion are the ingredients. So the ingredients of what makes instruction and more intense and powerful to support accelerated learning and support students in reading. I think now that we have the platform on what intensification is and what high quality instruction is, I want to add a little bit to say that we are also looking at applying what the evidence base says related to instruction. I know, Carolyn, you're so immersed in the science, and that is part of what we're doing with instruction to support that instruction, to support the problem solving. Kelly, I'm going to come to you, and this is a perfect way to transition into our next part of the conversation, which I want to get more into the systems of system support for responsiveness to instruction intervention. But to do this work, we've talked about it, we really have to use data. in a way to inform our decisions. And part of that is to use student data and implementation data. And I know, yeah, Kelly, I want you to talk more about that, because that's something you've spoken to before, I know.
Yeah, intervention fidelity or intervention or treatment integrity, it goes by a couple of different names, implementation data, has really been an area of interest of mine for so many years. And I think it's because I come to this, as many of us do, with the heart of a teacher. I was a classroom teacher for so many years. And so I truly believe that teachers are well-intended and they want to do what's best for students, but things get in the way, logistical elements. They need to be supported in order to implement with fidelity and with that treatment integrity that we hear so much about. And so when we're making sound decisions for students, we talk a lot about using two sources of data to make those decisions. And that's certainly our student outcome data, our progress monitoring data that's going to tell us how the student is responding. But we couple that or pair that with implementation data or intervention fidelity data so that we can look at the degree to which the instruction happened as designed. Because we can't say that an intervention is ineffective, insufficient, or not matched if we don't have evidence that the intervention or instruction was implemented in the first place. And if we have poor student response data, but then we look and we also have some pretty poor implementation data, that's a different problem to address, right? We won't necessarily jump to more intensification before we solve whatever that implementation error or miscommunication or problem is. That's our first line of action, is making sure that we're getting implementation or fidelity data where it should be. And then we can feel confident in that the student response data that we're looking at and using is indeed in response to instruction that was provided as designed or as evidence to be effective for students within our population.
Yeah, and so perfect, because I want to now shift into the system a little bit. And we know that we've got to be looking at these multiple sources of data, primarily to student data and then fidelity implementation data, what the instruction is looking like and working, is that instruction working. So within multi-tiered systems of support, we're using data, but I want to now get in the conversation of thinking about the system. What do we do when our data is telling us that students aren't making that progress we want to see? And so Kelly, I know you have written and spoken to the problem-solving process essential to that. So I'm going to go to you first to connect that to this. So thinking about when students aren't making that progress, how do we use a problem-solving approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it starts with the magnitude of the problem. Are we talking about a good majority of our students who are not making or meeting our expectations, mastering standards? Are we talking about a small group or just a few individuals? Because I think that really helps us determine the focus of our database problem solving. So if it is at large groups of students not meeting expectation, then again, I think we look at what that expectation would be for tier 1, which certainly, in order to have a well-functioning tiered system of instructional support, we really need the majority of students to be moving toward expectation or standards. That's not the case for all schools, but that is certainly the goal over time. And then I think once you have gotten a sense of where that current level is compared to the expected level, again, investing time in problem analysis in order to kind of get a sense of, so why is there that discrepancy between where we want students, either large groups of students within our tier 1 example, or if it's an individual student, why is there that gap between the two? And then again, using that information to design our instruction, implementing, because we can make the best decisions possible. And that kind of speaks to our responsiveness to intervention again, but we can make the best decisions possible, use evidence-based practices, but ultimately we're going to have to implement in order to determine whether we're on track or not, and then determine our next steps for just that continuous quest towards student improvement. And that's really is the goal, that we're going to be able to use data to modify or adjust instruction so that it is enabling learning for the majority of students.
Yeah, thank you so much. You really broke down that problem-solving process really clearly and practically. And I want to situate now my next question within the context of that. So we've got a problem-solving process occurring within our multi-tier systems of support. We also have something at work that we're doing, this responsiveness to intervention. And so, Jess, I'm going to go to you to help us sort out that a little bit. How does responsiveness to intervention fit within multi-tiered systems of support? They are, I'll let you break it down and tell us a little bit more about how we distinguish those things when we say multi-tiered systems of support, when we say responsiveness to intervention, situated within what Kelly was talking about, a problem-solving process.
Yeah, I think of it as like the RTI is the response intervention is a part of that larger system of multi-tiered systems of support. So situated within that is that response to intervention model. And students really thinking about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Some states, have tier 4 and tier 5, but thinking about your tiered support model. Students who have been identified as a student with disability or learning difficulty are receiving services across that tiered continuum. So they're getting, the first layer of prevention is their tier 1 core instruction, and then some students will receive that tier 2 and 3 plus, kind of depending on that tiered model and a state or a district. But really thinking about that tier 3 is not like reserved and set aside for that's where, our students who are identified as SPEDCO. They're really integrated within that system of support. And as they're moving kind of across those doses of prevention or across those tiers of instruction, their progress is being monitored, and we're looking for that rate of intervention. Are that rate of progress within that intervention support in tier 2 and tier 3? So that RTI process is kind of woven in to that multi-tier system of support to be able to look at those students who are receiving those advanced tiered supports to see, are they making adequate to ambitious growth? Are they responding to the intervention that we're providing? Is that, intervention being provided, as Kelly was saying, at the level of fidelity it should be, if we're expecting students to show that responsiveness? So really thinking about all of those pieces in an integrated way within that larger context of multi-tier systems of support. And as Kelly was talking, I was thinking about one of my favorite quotes from a NERN active implementation formula is, students cannot benefit from evidence-based practices they did not receive. So thinking about your response to intervention, students can't show growth and adequate progress if they're never receiving those evidence-based interventions. And that is a crucial kind of a crux to response to intervention. That instruction has to be in place in order for students to actually receive the instruction to show that adequate growth and that adequate progress within that response to intervention model.
Ooh. So thank you. So so profound and appropriate. I want to connect this to Carolyn. At this point, because Carolyn, one of the things I often see when schools trying to establish multi-tier systems of support is their work around core instruction. And this relates to what Jess said about, you have to be receiving that instruction with quality to really understand growth. So I'm going to let you kind of round out our conversation, and I'm moving back to you to emphasize this idea again about how important that core instruction is, even though we're talking about intensification and intervention.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I want to just, reiterate a little bit of what Kelly and Jess both said, is that in the absence of strong core instruction, it's going to be really difficult to support students in an intervention because, number one, you're going to have too many students and you're flooding your system and you're watering down in your instruction, and you're not going to be able to give that time and small groups and adequate dosage and all of the things that are necessary for an intervention. And so when we talk about the problem-solving model within a multi-tiered system of support, we want to problem solve what students need, what groups of students need or individuals individual students need, but we also want to problem solve the system too. And are we starting with that good, strong system that allows us to individually, if necessary, problem solve at the student level? So when we look at all of that, everything starts with that core, whether it be high quality instructional materials, the assessment system, and the teaming that's set up to support to support the system itself, but really making sure that we have this good strong ship that we're operating in, so that we're not flooding all of those layers and not able to provide that adequate support that we need for those students. The other thing that it all comes down to as well is having highly qualified, trained instructors to deliver this instruction. And I think we can't talk about any of multi-tiered system of support and evidence-based practices if nobody ever learns what to do and how to do these things. So there's so many facets that go into, we're talking about response to intervention, we're talking about interventions themselves, but it's really situated within that multi-tiered system of support, and nothing operates within a silo. Everything really is one piece of a puzzle that operates to support students and what they need.
Yeah, you said something I want to grab, and that's the teaming piece. I want to go there. I know we can't do this work in, like you said, in silos or as individuals, that it really is systems. And so I want to speak to that a bit and kind of let you link to this idea of leveraging what you can in your system. Use some multidisciplinary support. So I'll go back to you, Carolyn, to add more to that.
Yeah, I think within a school setting, we have to leverage all of the teaming structures that we have available within the school. So we start with that school leadership team and the data that they're looking at, making sure that they have access to that strong screening data to make those instructional decisions across the grade levels to see where, some grade levels might have stronger supports than others. We look at the grade level teaming system to make sure that each of those individual grade levels have the support that they need and are providing the right kind of instruction with the right kind of materials. But then we also have those very specialized teams, like a multidisciplinary team that's really charged with those individual decision-making opportunities, either for small groups of students or when it comes time need be those individual students. And that multidisciplinary team really has to have that intense specialized knowledge to be able to look at the screening data, but also to look at the progress monitoring data to make sure that, okay, did we apply the right intervention? Is there that go upness in the data of the progress monitoring? Is our students really making that accelerated growth? But then also to take a look at what Kelly was talking about, the fidelity of the implementation of the intervention. Because if students aren't making progress, we really first have to rule out what the adults are doing that has perhaps been a barrier to preventing students from making that progress. And so that multidisciplinary team is a really integral part of ensuring that, number one, your multi-tiered system of support is working well, but two, that the interventions that you're matching to students are really doing and having the effect that they're supposed to be having.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and absolutely, I love how you set that up and framed it. Thanks, Carolyn. I'll go to Jess and then Kelly, just any other thing you would like to add related to teaming, reinforce within the context of our conversation. So to Jess first.
Yeah, I think just looking at teams and then how is that like all getting orchestrated within that system. I think that the piece of the school leader and just thinking about like the importance of that school leader in orchestrating all of the teaming things that are going on across the school building. So really thinking about that school leader as the instructional leader. One thing that they're kind of orchestrating is all of those teaming structures, but really supporting instruction, ultimately ensuring like academic success for all their students. They're kind of the allocators and the culture creators for all of that teaming to take place. So thinking about allocation of staff, who are my grade level instructors, who are my professional and my paraprofessionals, who are my specialists that are on these different teams across the school building, and how are they all communicating with one another, and what is that system of communication from the team to the other, players that may not be part of the core team, but that still need that kind of relay of information there. And then allocation of resources. So thinking about instructional materials, those teaming structures will use as they're addressing different student needs across the building, thinking about schedules, like just building the master schedule to allocate time, and then a like meeting schedule, like when are all these meetings taking place and how are we really utilizing to the capacity that we can in our buildings within those teams across settings. And then thinking about like the professional learning that those teams have to take part in, right? To really keep their skills kind of to the caliber that they need to be able to then address the needs of students across those tiers of support and and quality instruction, and having all the people part of that learning. So bringing in our paraprofessionals, bringing in our assistants, bringing in your school leader, being part of that. So they're learning alongside you and can then help and support implementation as those conversations are happening from team to team, and those connections are needing to be made across settings, really thinking about that school leader, not necessarily doing all the things, but as present and allocating and building the culture for all of that learning and support to take place within the school building.
Yeah, and our research has shown that we need our school leaders, that they're just intrinsic to the process. So I'm happy you spoke to that. Kelly, I'm going to let you close this out on teaming. I'm going to ask you a direct question though, before you share anything you'd like to share. I don't want to leave parents and families off the list here. And so if you can include sort of addressing their role and how important that is, that'd be wonderful.
Of course, of course. And I love the way Carolyn emphasized the need for that multidisciplinary team. It's not our expectation that any one individual has all the expertise that is needed in order to effectively serve our students. So I love that team-based approach where we're able to be better together, right? And really rely on each other's expertise. I think, Jess, you touched on such an important part of infrastructure as well, and making sure that the professional learning is in place, making sure that we're thinking about the systems that support the teams, and the resources are at their fingertips. I think there has to be a plan for that. That has to be an intentional plan to build capacity and sustain capacity of that team. So many of, as I mentioned a minute ago, so many of the schools I live with, or not live with, but work with, have limited resources and time. And so they're really leaning into the idea of job embedded. So by, making doing as learning. So they're engaging in problem solving and provision of tiered supports, and then skilling up and scaling up simultaneously. I think the family piece is so critical, and I'm really glad that you brought that to light, because I worry about us doing that as an afterthought or in the 11th hour. And I think we have to really give thought to those critical elements related to communication and collaboration and what those implications are for parents and families. How do we keep them updated, abreast of how children are responding within the context of core Tier 1 instruction? And then how are we enrolling their support and their collaboration, their team membership, when a child is demonstrating a need for more intensified supports? There shouldn't be any alarms going off. It shouldn't really rock our world when we're intensifying. We want to make sure that the parent is in the loop, if we can do that proactively, and thinking about how that occurs throughout our tiered system of supports, keeping them at the table and really being able to benefit from the rich context and information that they're able to share about their child. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No, so important. And I think we can't do it alone. And so your examples are really important to enhance that. I'm looking at our clock, and so we are narrowing down our time. And I'd like to do this to have us conclude. First, to have each of you sort of share lessons learned or a key takeaway or big idea or something salient you'd like to just put a punctuation on this conversation. And so we'll sort of go around the room, if you will, and just sort of share any concluding thoughts or contributions you like to make, including any resources or references, if you have those you'd like to share. then I've been looking at, we have a couple of questions that have come in, and I think we'll have time to look at those. And I'll be ready at least to start with the first one, and then we'll see how much time we have based on your conversation around that question. So just to conclude, big ideas, takeaways. I'll start with Carolyn first, then Jess, then Kelly. Yeah, Carolyn, big ideas and takeaways.
Yeah, I think my big takeaway from talking about intervention is that interventions aren't successful in and of themselves. I think it's really about that whole support system that we are providing for students, that we're providing the adults that are making the instructional decisions. And so while intervention is a piece and a very important piece of the puzzle, we also have to think about how we are evaluating and supporting the entire system that will eventually then support the interventions along the way.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, Jess, big ideas and takeaways.
Yeah, I think mine is semi but related to the conversation today. We've talked a lot about implementation, so implementation of instruction and evidence-based practices and meeting structures. And I think often the de-implementation, which I think of it as kind of like it's close but often overlooked colleague, is super important too. So being able to think in your school-based teams and in your interdisciplinary teams, and really from that leadership perspective, what are we implementing that maybe isn't evidence-based and isn't serving students well, and taking that off the plate to kind of free up room to integrate some of these evidence-based practices in, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 in our teaming structures. Are we meeting just to meet, or like what are the purposes for those meetings that we're having? So really thinking through like meeting inventories and your intervention protocol inventories, and looking at your kind of what your core materials are in instruction. What are those things that we have that are evidence-based, and they're serving our population well and effectively, and being able to kind of take a step back from those things that are no longer doing that. And that can be really hard. Often it's tied to transition and what we're comfortable with. And sometimes folks' identities are kind of wrapped into what they're doing in their classrooms or their instructional settings. So just being really mindful of conversations, not only about implementation, but also that de-implementation of things that are no longer serving staff and students in buildings.
Yeah, good punctuation mark. Yeah, Kelly.
Yeah, so I think we have touched on the implementation fidelity and the intervention fidelity throughout today's session. So I appreciate that. So that to me has been a huge lesson learned and a huge takeaway for me throughout my year supporting schools. So if I could leave the group with a few things, that would certainly be one of them, just the importance of intervention fidelity and making sure that the educators who are taking responsibility for providing instruction, regardless of the tier, have the necessary support. They have the materials, the resources, the time protected within their schedule to provide that instruction, coaching as necessary, demonstration, modeling, whatever it takes. And I think building that and making it part of our planning process to where you take a moment, you turn to the educators who will be implementing and saying, what supports do you need to be successful? And then allowing them to let us know as a team how we can support them. And they're not out there floating and implementing alone. Yeah. I think the second thing that I would end, just real quickly, is encouraging folks to think about a multi-tiered system of support as the way in which we educate all students. This is our way of work. And so that's so much easier when you conceptualize it that way, to make those connections to the great work and the great pieces of our existing infrastructure that are already in place, and allows people to make connections to that, reinforce that work, and then look critically, as Jess alluded to, look critically about our practices and make those very important decisions as to what do we continue and reinforce and actually expand upon, and what are some of those practices and resources that perhaps are not matched to our population, but have been grandfathered in year after year, that we probably need to let go of in favor of things that are more evidence-based and more targeted to the children that we serve.
Thank you all so much. And my punctuation mark is that we're looking at something that's dynamic. It's a dynamic system, really focused centrally on responsiveness and student responsiveness to that instruction. And so I think that kind of idea leads us into the question that I would like to pose related to one of our participants. I'll read that for you. I think you can also look at it in your Q&A as well. But let's discuss this first one that was submitted here. Although the language of choice is multi-tiered systems of support, technically, special education requires specialized instruction and progress monitoring for effective progress. And the rights of parents and students for effective IEP goals with effective evidence-based instruction specific to reading and the child's needs. Not that the response to intervention process decided the intensiveness of intervention. I think it's great clarification. In fact, IDEA and OSEP say MTSS cannot be used to delay, absolutely, and deny appropriate instruction and teacher qualification and evidence-based. So the question then is, how do you ensure that MTSS is not delaying what we can know from the data related to the if intensity is needed? So look, I think that's important. How do we ensure that there's no delay in providing support or service? Yeah, any of you, you're welcome to share thoughts, and we can build on your sharing.
So I'll jump in real quick, and I'll be brief because I want Jess and Carolyn to have a chance to respond to it as well. I think the first thing I would say is really important to keep in mind that specially designed instruction occurs within a multi-tiered system of support, and those two concepts are not mutually exclusive. They can and should operate in tandem with each other and be well integrated. More specifically to that question about how do we make sure that multi-tiered system of support or tiered instruction more specifically is not delaying a child's access to specially designed instruction or to the supports and services of special education. The opposite should be true. If you go back a couple of decades, one of the big promises of RTI was, and I can see it in a title of an article, no more wait to fail, because any child within that system should be able to receive more intensive supports just by virtue of needing it. It does not require any special eligibility. All supports are available to all students. That does not mean that we withhold specially designed instruction. Certainly, we want the same process to help us identify children who are going to need those supports of special education in order to meet expectations. We want that to happen in a timely manner, and it should happen. We're obligated to ensure that. So those are my thoughts. I want to hand it off to my colleagues to make sure they get a chance to share.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Carolyn.
Yeah, I think I also, everything that Kelly said, ditto on that. And also to make sure that we are using the right assessments, to make sure that we are identifying early on and not using a wait to fail model to make, to exasperate gaps that might happen along the way, but using that really strong assessment system, providing the instruction, the intervention, when students need it, how much they need it within, again, that multi-tiered system of support. I also think too, when we think about special education and eligibility determination, and we think about specially designed instruction, that specially designed instruction really does need to be special and unique to that individual child, and making sure that using that assessment data, we really have drilled down and provided goals and expectations for the student that align with discrete goals of reading development and what we know about those stair steps along the way, the simple view of reading, the component parts of reading, and making sure that we're identifying those specific needs to ensure that that child is going to make not only the progress, but accelerate and double accelerate their progress to meet up with their grade level peers.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And I just want to add quickly too, that though we have successive levels of tiers, we don't have to, for some students, it doesn't make sense to follow that. They're going to need more intensive support. And we know that, right? We're not waiting to go necessarily for all students to go through tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. It's a multi-tier dynamic system. And yeah, I think Sharon Vaughn and others have done some work along those lines. And I think that's important to look at. It's supportive of that not waiting sort of approach when we're looking at students. I'm sorry, Jess, but we are at time. I know we have one remaining question, but I think we can try to follow up and provide an answer to that within the context of posting this webinar. So I don't want to ignore that was out there and the importance of that question. But I need to turn it back to Sarah to help us conclude our webinar. And I am so thankful for all of you for this conversation and your time. It's really been a pleasure. Sarah, I'll send it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lena. And thank you to our panelists for sharing their perspectives and experience, and our attendees for participating today. We hope you join us for future Reading the Room events. You will receive a recording of today's event and will also be posted on the NCIL website. A brief feedback form for the event will automatically launch in your web browser when you leave the webinar, and we kindly ask for you to complete it then. To stay abreast of the latest NCIL news and information, please follow us on Facebook at Improving Literacy or on X at NCIL Literacy, and sign up for our newsletter at improvingliteracy.org. Thank you again for joining us for the 9th Reading the Room event in our series and your interest in promoting evidence-based literacy practices. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.